Necrobarista is this game about necromancers running a coffee shop in purgatory, but its high-concept fantasy setting is the least of what it does differently. Narratively, by virtue of its setting and pacing, it falls into the same lineage as Valhalla, Coffee Talk, or Neocab, but you can't just place it into that same box because mechanically it's closest to your standard visual novel in that most of the game is just clicking through dialogue without any attached gameplay systems. But its most dramatic and effective choices are in its aesthetic direction, which hews closer to games like The Walking Dead or Life is Strange, without any of the same gameplay conceits like getting to choose dialogue options. Necrobarista can draw comparisons with a lot of different narrative lineages in the gaming medium, but it doesn't quite belong to any one of them. There isn't much out there that's gonna hit quite like Necrobarista, where you're sitting there listening to characters making incredibly online millennial jokes, and then all of a sudden you just get hit by a beautiful shot like this. And that just isn't a combination you run into very often in video games, and it's created something really unique that I'm pretty excited to break down for you all today. But as always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're mingling with the dead in Necrobarista. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free review copy of this game, so heads up. So as I touched on, Necrobarista is a bit of an anomaly. It's basically a visual novel falling into the same vein as similar titles like Valhalla and Coffee Talk, using a service industry as a vehicle to shove interesting characters in front of the player and explore high-concept speculative fiction ideas, while oozing a hefty dose of millennial hipster charm. But Necrobarista's big contribution to the genre is the addition of an actual camera. Where most visual novels use a small set of static sprites or drawings in a simple text box, Necrobarista makes everything from characters to the environment 3D, and that means that suddenly you have all these extra tools to work with when conveying a narrative scene. Where other visual novels are basically books with accompanying imagery and the occasional attached gameplay loop, Necrobarista feels significantly more cinematic. Like, this game clearly had an actual video editor that framed every line of dialogue with its own accompanying shot, just like one would cut together a movie in post. The closest analogs to this would be a Telltale or Don't Nod game, and even those don't have camera work as striking or dynamic as Necrobarista's. There isn't a single line of voice acting, and the characters only ever move to accentuate changes in mood, just like in any other visual novel, but suddenly Necrobarista has a million new tools to play with to convey its narrative because of this one change. And this game runs wild with them. The characters actually get to inhabit the spaces they're in, which adds an entire level to their performances other visual novels can't match. And when the deliberate framing isn't creating incredibly screenshotable slow pans, it makes brilliant shots like this. Or this. Or this entire sequence. And it would be really easy to just sit back and go, wow, this is a leap forward for the entire genre. Why doesn't every visual novel just do this? But the whole advantage of visual novels is that they are dirt cheap and easy to make compared to other kinds of games. It's a medium more or less defined by its budgetary restraints, and when you can break out of those restraints, you get a rare gem that really stands out, like Necrobarista. But because of those same defining restrictions, it's equally difficult to laud this game's accomplishments, and they are accomplishments, without noting that most of its medium likely would never have the sort of money and staff to replicate them. And indeed, for a while it looked like even Necrobarista wasn't going to make it, as it was repeatedly delayed for an entire year. Whenever a title gets delayed so often and for so long, it's often remarked upon as a miracle that it successfully came out at all. But here it is. And it's good! And so Necrobarista is an anomaly you should savor, because if you ever see something like this again, it's probably not going to be for a while. But alright, now that I'm done pitching why you should care about this game, let's dial it back a bit. What's this game actually about? Necrobarista takes place in the Terminal, a coffee shop that also happens to be a bus stop for the dearly departed on their way to the afterlife. They still pay the physical bills thanks to mortal clientele, but the actual story revolves around the less earthly visitors that walk in the door. That's kinda just where the set dressing starts, however. There's a whole society of life/death magic-wielding mages that oversee that magic's use, and Maddie, the owner of the terminal, owes a time debt to them. See, turns out the law of equivalent exchange is in full force in this universe, so when someone manages to steal extra time on the mortal plane, that time has to come from somewhere else. And Maddie's bar has borrowed so much time that they have to screen calls from the Death Mage IRS. They also do forbidden magic on the side and stuff, which doesn't earn them many friends, but like, come on, what proper Death Mage isn't into forbidden magic? Overall, it's a pretty solid story, if perhaps an extremely meandering one filled with random side tangents that are never resolved. Like, there's this one scene where these two students randomly show up for all of about 15 minutes and get pretty entertaining introductions. But they're basically there just to exist, never show up again after they're introduced, and don't do anything to actually move the plot along. But it still kind of works, because the game's focused on characters that are likable enough to get away with it. Like all of these indie service games, the narrative focus is heavily placed on quirky and interesting characters with their individual plot arcs. But unlike most of these games, the heart of the story isn't the customers, it's the store's owners. And a lot of these side tangents are utilized to show different sides of those characters that they don't as readily express. But ultimately, when the game is firing on all cylinders is in its simplest scenes, when it just lets two characters bounce off of each other. It doesn't matter whether it's a real heart-to-heart, just a couple guys enjoying a sunrise, or indeed, even some of those side tangents. But Necrobarista works best when it just has two people sitting around talking about life. And that's more unique for the gaming medium as a whole than it really should be. And like the rest of Necrobarista's strengths, it's all the more obvious when it's suddenly absent during the game's weakest segments. Between each of the main plot's individual episodes, you can walk around the coffee shop and unlock little text-based side stories. These optional mini side adventures are fine, but when placed side by side with the main storyline, they're not particularly compelling. More than anything, their existence as a point of comparison really drives home just how much the rest of the game benefits from its camera work and how well its carefully crafted main cast of characters bounce off of each other. But before we go off on too many side tangents of our own, let's wrap this up. What do you get out of 5 hours with Necrobarista? That was just enough time for me to finish the game's main plot, but I should note that I also started skipping the side stories I just got finished talking about. I knew where my time was best spent. I didn't really suffer for skipping the side content, so I'd say that you can see pretty much everything in 5 hours, but there's another hour or two of bonus content if you really want to stick around in Necrobarista's universe. But overall, I think that the game's main plotline is fantastic, and it's definitely one worth seeing all the way through to the end. Necrobarista is a game that feels far more special than it should. The idea of 3D modeling everything and actually using a camera shouldn't feel like the revolutionary leap that it does, but here we are where not a whole lot of people are really doing anything quite like it, and nobody is doing it as well. It stands out from other visual novels for even having a camera in the first place, but it also stands out against everything else in the medium by almost entirely taking control of that camera away from the player to execute its own artistic vision. 90% of the game is just hitting spacebar to see the next shot and its accompanying dialogue, and in that sense, people might accuse it of just being a movie or a really well blocked out comic book, but those distinctions aren't really important to me. What's important is the fact that it works, and it's extremely entertaining. And similarly, the thought of a game that's almost entirely composed of one-on-one conversations between a small cast of characters isn't that wild a concept. Just look at all the work Dontnod is putting out. And yet, anytime I come across it, it feels like such a rare thing to see that idea executed so well in the video game space, where narrative excellence is usually attributed to RPGs with massive scripts and a million things going on, or experimental indies like Edith Finch that use the medium to fundamentally play with how we tell stories. Necrobarista exists in a very thin space between those things. Sure, it has plenty of well-done fantasy trappings, but at the end of the day, it's about entertaining people vibing in a coffee shop, and small and intimate narratives like that only rarely bubble to the top of this medium. And for all those reasons, I genuinely think that there's nothing out there that feels quite like it, nor that we'll see it replicated again in a hurry. And because of that, Necrobarista is all the more noteworthy, and you should absolutely check it out. Hey guys, if you like what you're seeing here, consider supporting me on Patreon. With your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.